Silas Kane had always known the land would shape his fate, but nothing in his past could have prepared him for the day the wind changed and the world he knew began to unravel. The Montana highlands in the winter of 1888 were a place of brutal honesty, a vast, unforgiving canvas of white and gray that tolerated life but never promised it. His cabin, nestled against the spine of the Bitterroot Mountains, was a solitary outpost against the silence, its timbers groaning under the weight of a solitude he had chosen for himself. He was a man carved from the same quiet, resilient material as the mountains themselves. His movements deliberate, his words few, his presence as steady and unobtrusive as the ancient pines that stood guard around his claim. The storm did not arrive. It materialized, as if the sky had simply given up its color and collapsed into a swirling vortex of white fury. It began as a whisper, a cold breath against the windowpane, then grew into a relentless howl that clawed at the roof and rattled the door in its frame. Snow fell not in flakes, but in horizontal sheets, erasing the familiar lines of the landscape. For 2 days, Silas moved within the confines of his small world, the rhythm of his life dictated by the needs of the fire and the care of his horse in the lean-to stable. His time was spent chopping wood, checking the seals on the windows, and sitting by the fire, listening to the storm's symphony. The solitude was an old friend, but in moments like these, it felt heavier, its edges sharper. On the third day, as dusk began to bleed its gray ink into the white maelstrom, something caught his eye through the frosted glass of the window. A shape, dark and unnatural against the snow, staggering near the edge of the tree line where his property met the open wilderness. At first, he thought it a deer, lost and weakened by the storm, but the shape was wrong, too burdened, too desperate. Pulling on his heavy coat, his jaw set, he grabbed the rifle that rested by the door not out of aggression, but out of habit. In this world, a man unprepared was a man already gone. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and driving ice crystals into his skin. He leaned into the gale, his boots sinking deep into the snow with every step, his eyes fixed on the struggling form. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a horror he had not anticipated: a wagon, its canvas top shredded and one wheel shattered. Sinking into a deep drift, beside it, a figure in a thin, worn coat stumbled, fell to her knees, then rose again with a strength that seemed drawn not from the body, but from a will that refused to break. He reached her just as she fell a final time. Without the strength to rise, it was a woman, her face a mask of windburn and frost. Her lips cracked and blue. She looked up at him as he knelt, her eyes dazed but holding a flicker of fierce, primal light. She tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound escaped her throat as her gloveless hand, raw and red, pointed weakly toward the broken wagon. Silas didn't need words. Seeing the slight movement under a pile of blankets in the wagon bed, his own survival instincts fused with a sudden, overwhelming sense of duty. Inside, huddled together, were two small children, a boy of perhaps 8 or 9, with wide, terrified eyes that mirrored his mother's defiance, and a little girl, no older than 5, her face pale and still. The boy had wrapped his own thin coat around his sister, a silent, heartbreaking act of protection. As Silas reached for the girl, the boy let out a small, fierce growl, trying to shield her. Silas paused, his gaze meeting the boy's, his look steady, conveying a promise of help, not harm. Without another moment's hesitation, he began his work. He lifted the little girl first, her body terrifyingly light, and wrapped her in the heavy wool blanket he had brought. He then turned to the boy, who flinched but did not resist as Silas bundled him up. Lastly, he returned to the woman, Lena Caldwell, lifting her limp body into his arms. With the children secured on his horse, He led them through the blinding snow, no longer just a man surviving, but a shepherd guiding his lost flock through the valley of death. Back inside the cabin, the sudden warmth and light were a shock. He laid Lena gently on the rug before the hearth, piling every blanket he owned on top of her. He placed the children beside her, then worked to stoke the fire, its hungry flames roaring back to life. He moved with a quiet efficiency, melting snow for water, warming a broth he had made days before. The cabin, usually a bastion of silence, was now filled with the faint sounds of life, a stark contrast to the distant howl of the wind. Lena's eyes fluttered open. She stared at the rough-hewn ceiling, confusion warring with exhaustion on her face. Her gaze fell upon her children, safe beside her, and a single tear traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. When she tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Silas was there instantly, a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Be still," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're safe now." He held a spoon of warm broth to her lips. As she drank, the warmth spread through her, chasing away the deep, biting cold. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw not just gratitude, but a profound and weary sorrow. The boy, Leo, was awake, watching Silas with an unwavering, suspicious gaze. He had positioned himself between the man and his mother, a small, silent guardian, when Silas offered him broth. The boy shook his head, his jaw tight. Silas didn't press, simply leaving the bowl nearby, a silent offering. As Lena regained a little more strength, the full weight of their salvation settled upon her. She looked around the small, sparse cabin at the stacked firewood, the neatly hung tools, the single-worn chair. It was a man's space, solitary and self-contained, yet the safest place she had been in months. The dam of her composure, held for so long, finally broke. She turned her face away and wept, not loudly, but with silent, body-racking sobs. Silas, a man unaccustomed to tears, stood awkwardly for a moment before turning away to give her privacy. He busied himself by checking the children's hands and feet for serious frostbite, his touch surprisingly gentle. His own bed, a simple cot in the corner, was given over to them, piled high with blankets. For himself, he would take the floor by the fire, a clear, unspoken boundary. He was their protector, not their companion. The night passed in a haze of strained silence. The only sounds the howl of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft breathing of the sleeping girl. Lena drifted in and out of a restless sleep, while across the room, Leo lay perfectly still. Silas knew the boy wasn't sleeping. He could feel the weight of his stare in the darkness. A silent, unblinking sentinel. Morning brought no relief, only a brighter, more relentless white pressing in on all sides. The world outside had vanished. Silas moved with his usual quiet purpose, the aroma of coffee filling the small space with a scent of normalcy. He noticed the bowl of broth he had left for Leo was empty, though the boy now sat by the hearth, whittling a piece of kindling with a small pocket knife. Refusing to acknowledge the man who had saved him, Lena finally sat up, her movements stiff but more certain. "The horse," she said, her voice still hoarse. "Our mare, is she—" Silas looked up from mending a leather strap. "I'll check on her when the wind dies down. My own is safe in the stable." His tone was flat, factual, offering no false hope. It was a language she understood. The land didn't deal in promises, only in what was. She nodded, accepting the harsh reality. Silas looked around the small room. At the three strangers thrown into his life by the storm, the silence he had so carefully cultivated was gone, replaced by a fragile, unspoken responsibility. He looked out the window at the raging blizzard, knowing it showed no signs of stopping. They were trapped here, together. He was no longer just a man on a mountain. He was their anchor in the storm, their only hope. The realization settled upon him, not as a burden, but as a simple, undeniable fact. The land had given them to him, and it was now his duty to keep them. The storm raged for another day before finally breaking, leaving behind a world sculpted into alien shapes of white. The silence that followed was profound, a heavy blanket that seemed to absorb all sound, making the small cabin feel even more isolated. For days, they were marooned, an island in a sea of snow. The initial shock gave way to a strained, awkward domesticity. The small space, once perfectly ordered to the needs of one man, now felt crowded. Silas found his routines disrupted, the familiar solitude of his home replaced by a constant, low-level awareness of others. The scent of pine and leather he was used to was now mingled with the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and the faint, unfamiliar smell of a woman's hair. Lena's strength returned slowly, and with it, a fierce, quiet pride. She refused to be an invalid, taking over the small tasks of the cabin with a determined efficiency that was both admirable and a little heartbreaking. She mended tears in the children's clothes with a needle and thread from her own small satchel. Her stitches neat and even. One evening, Silas noticed she was darning one of his own work shirts, which had a tear at the elbow he'd long ignored. He said nothing, but when he wore it the next day, the neatly patched fabric felt strangely warm against his skin, a sensation that had nothing to do with the fire. She learned the rhythms of the wood stove, keeping it fed without being asked, her presence becoming a steady, contributing force. The air between her and Silas was thick with unspoken things. They moved around each other with a careful courtesy, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same kettle or log. A jolt of contact that was both startling and strangely grounding. Their meals were silent affairs, the only sounds the scraping of spoons against wooden bowls and the crackle of the fire. Silas was not a man for small talk, and Lena seemed to carry a sorrow too heavy for words. Yet, in that shared silence, a new language began to form. He started leaving a small piece of dried fruit by Willa's bowl each morning, a gesture she would answer with a shy, gap-toothed smile. He noticed Lena's eyes linger on the small shelf of books. He kept a Bible, a well-thumbed almanac, and a few volumes of Shakespeare. One afternoon, he simply placed one of the books on the table beside her without a word. That evening, he found her reading to Willa by the firelight, her voice a low, soothing murmur that filled the cabin with a warmth he hadn't realized it lacked. The children were two different worlds. Willa, the little girl, emerged from her shell of exhaustion with a child's simple resilience. She was fascinated by a small, unfinished carving of a hawk that sat on Silas's mantelpiece. One afternoon, she approached him as he sat cleaning his rifle, her small finger pointing at the wooden bird. "Is he sleeping?" she whispered. Silas paused, his large, calloused hand still. He looked at the bird, then at her. "No," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "He's waiting to fly." After that, Willa would often sit near him, watching him work in a comfortable silence. A small, trusting shadow who seemed to understand that his quietness was not a sign of anger. Leo, however, remained a fortress. The boy was his mother's protector, his eyes missing nothing. He watched Silas with a cold, calculating suspicion, his posture always defensive. One afternoon, Silas went out to clear a path to the woodpile. He found Leo already there, struggling to lift an axe that was nearly as tall as he was. Silas approached slowly. "That's a splitting axe," he said, his voice even. "You need a felling axe for the smaller logs. Here, let me show you." He reached for the tool, but Leo dropped it and stepped back, his face a mask of defiance. "I can do it myself," the boy muttered, turning his back on the man. The attempt at connection had failed, leaving a colder silence in its wake. Later that night, Silas saw the boy through the cabin window, standing over the snow-covered mound where their mare had fallen, his small shoulders shaking in the moonlight. Silas understood then that the boy's anger was just a shield for a grief too large for his small frame. That evening, as the fire painted the cabin in hues of orange and gold, Lena finally spoke of the past. She sat on the floor, mending one of Leo's worn shirts, her face illuminated by the flames. "We were headed for Helena," she began, her voice low, not looking at him. "My husband, he died of a fever back in Kansas. He had a cousin there, a blacksmith. He said there was work, a chance to start over." She spoke of their small farm, of the drought that had taken everything, the cracked earth that had swallowed their hopes. She described the difficult decision to sell what little they had left for a broken-down wagon and a dream of a better life. A dream that had died with their horse just a few hundred yards from his door. Silas listened without interruption, his hands busy sharpening a knife. But his attention was fixed on her. He heard the story she wasn't telling, the story of a woman pushed to the absolute limit, who had shouldered the weight of her family's survival alone. Her quiet recitation of facts was more powerful than any plea for sympathy. It made her real to him, not just a survivor he had pulled from the snow, but a woman of immense, quiet strength. The cabin no longer felt like just his space invaded by strangers. It was now a shelter holding the fragile remnants of a family's shattered hopes. He found himself looking at the empty chair across the hearth, a piece of furniture he'd never paid mind to, and for the first time, it felt truly empty. As the days turned into a week, the reality of their situation became undeniable. The snow was a prison, beautiful and deadly. Lena's pride, the very thing that had kept her going, now became a source of torment. She would lie awake at night on the cot, listening to the steady breathing of her children and the quiet presence of the man on the floor, and a cold dread would seep into her heart. They were living on his charity, eating his food, burning his wood. Every act of kindness was another link in a chain of debt she could never hope to repay. One morning, as Silas returned from checking on the horses, he found her standing by the door, her chin lifted in a familiar gesture of hard-won resolve. "The snow is starting to melt on the south-facing slopes," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched at her sides. "As soon as a path is clear, we'll be on our way. I can't thank you enough for what you've done. But we can't impose on you any longer." Silas set down the bucket of water he was carrying, the silence stretching between them. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and then at Leo and Willa, who were watching from the corner. Their faces etched with a new anxiety. He saw not a burden, but a family on the brink of annihilation. He knew with a cold certainty that if they left, they would not survive another day in the wilderness. The land would claim them. He walked across the room until he was standing directly in front of her, his shadow falling over her. His gaze was intense. Holding hers, "I'll marry you," he said. The words were not a proposal, but a statement of fact, delivered in a low, even tone that cut through the quiet of the room. Lena's eyes widened, her mouth falling slightly open in shock. Her mind reeled. This was not a kindness, it was an absurdity, a madness born of isolation and snow. "What are you saying?" she whispered, taking a step back. "I'll marry you," he repeated, his voice unwavering, taking a step forward to close the distance she had made. "It's the only way. You and the children will have a home, a name. You won't freeze. This isn't about feelings, it's a solution." He wasn't offering his heart, or love, or even companionship. He was offering survival. a contract written against the harsh law of the mountains. He was offering her a life, but the price was a bond forged not of affection, but of sheer, desperate necessity. Lena stared at him, the man's words hanging in the air like frost. Marry him. The proposition was so stark, so devoid of sentiment, that it felt more like a verdict than a proposal. Her pride, the last tattered remnant of her old life, screamed in protest. To accept would be to admit utter defeat, to become a dependent, a charity case with a wedding ring. But then she looked at her children. She saw the fear in Leo's eyes, a fear he tried so hard to hide behind a scowl, and the innocent trust in Willa's, who was now looking from her mother to Silas as if they were discussing the weather. The fight went out of her, replaced by the cold, hard pragmatism of a mother. "All right," she whispered. The word barely audible. It was not an acceptance of a marriage, but an acceptance of a lifeline. Silas simply nodded, as if a business transaction had been concluded. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly, becoming heavier, more charged. Leo, who had heard everything, now looked at Silas not as a rescuer, but as something else, a stranger who had laid claim to his mother. The boy's resentment became a palpable thing, a silent, bitter wall between them. A week later, the path to the small, dusty town of Redemption was finally passable. The journey was made in near silence. Lena sat on the wagon bench beside Silas, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She felt the weight of Leo's stare from the back of the wagon, a silent judgment she couldn't face. The justice of the peace was a balding man with tired eyes who presided over his duties from a small office above the general store. He read the words from his book in a monotone voice, the legal phrases sounding hollow and strange in the stuffy room. Lena Caldwell became Lena Kane. There were no rings, no flowers, no well wishes. The only witnesses were her children and a clerk who was more interested in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam from the window. The entire ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Afterward, Silas bought a small bag of rock candy for Willa and a new, sharper blade for Leo's pocket knife. He bought nothing for Lena, and she asked for nothing. The contract was sealed. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a messy, reluctant thaw. The world dripped and oozed, the snow shrinking away to reveal the bruised, brown earth beneath. The sound of running water was everywhere as the creek swelled and the land began to breathe again. Life on the small homestead fell into a new rhythm. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, mending the fences that had collapsed under the weight of the snow, tilling a small patch of land near the cabin for a garden. Lena, now his wife in name, worked alongside him. She learned to read the soil, to know which seeds to plant where. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and capable. She turned the small cabin from a man's solitary shelter into a home, her touch evident in the neatly stacked shelves, the scent of baking bread, and the clean-swept floor. Yet, the space between them remained. They were partners in labor, allies against the wilderness. But they slept in separate spaces, she and the children on the cot, he on the floor by the hearth. Their conversations were about practical things: the weather, the state of the fences, the needs of the coming season. It was a life built on shared work, not shared intimacy. One evening, while cleaning, Lena found an old, dented tin box tucked away on a high shelf. Inside were a few faded photographs of a woman with a kind smile and a young boy who looked startlingly like Silas, along with a woman's silver locket. Tarnished with age, she put it back without a word, her heart aching with a strange mix of curiosity and sorrow. The discovery was a stark reminder that this silent man had a past of his own, a history he kept locked away just as tightly as she kept hers. One afternoon in late spring, as the first green shoots were pushing through the soil in their garden, A rider appeared on the horizon. He was not a neighbor, nor a passing trapper. This man rode a fine horse, and his clothes, though dusty from the trail, were of a better cut than was common in these parts. He rode directly to the cabin as if he knew exactly where he was going. Silas, who had been repairing a harness on the porch, stood up slowly, his body tensing, his hand resting near the axe propped against the wall. Leo, who had been helping his mother weed the garden, immediately ran to her side, his small face set in a hard line. The man dismounted with a practiced ease, a wide, confident smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "A fine piece of land you have here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the property with a proprietary air. He was handsome in a slick, predatory way, his eyes sharp and assessing. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Caldwell. I was told I might find her in this direction." Lena felt a cold dread wash over her. It was a name she hadn't heard in months, a ghost from a life she was trying to bury. She stepped forward, wiping her soiled hands on her apron. "I am Lena," she said, her voice tight. "Ah, excellent," the man said, his smile widening. He tipped his hat. "Jedediah Thorne, at your service. I was a business associate of your late husband." The name meant nothing to her. But the way he said it, the possessive glint in his eye as he looked from her to the cabin, sent a shiver of fear down her spine. Silas stepped off the porch, positioning himself between the stranger and his family. He did not speak, but his presence was a silent, unmovable wall. Jedediah's eyes flickered toward Silas, a flicker of amusement in their depths. "And you must be the man who's been looking after her. Very noble of you." The days that followed were a slow, simmering torment. Jedediah did not leave. He made a camp just beyond the edge of their property, a constant, menacing presence. His campfire was a malevolent orange eye in the darkness, a reminder that they were being watched. He would ride by the cabin several times a day, always with that same unsettling smile. He tried to engage Leo in conversation, offering him a silver coin, which the boy refused with a venomous glare. He cornered Lena one morning as she was fetching water from the creek. His words smooth, but his implications clear. "A woman like you shouldn't be wasting away out here," he'd said. "There are better opportunities for a woman who knows how to be agreeable." The fragile peace they had built was shattered, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. The unspoken bond between Silas and Lena tightened. No longer just a contract, but a silent alliance against a common threat. The breaking point came one afternoon when Silas had ridden out to check the far fences. Jedediah chose his moment perfectly. He strode into the garden where Lena was working, the children close by her side. "We need to talk, Lena," he said. His friendly tone gone, replaced by a cold, hard edge. "Your husband, bless his soul, was not a man of his word. He owed me a great deal of money. Money he secured with the deed to a plot of land near Helena." Lena stood up, her heart pounding. "That land was meant for us. It was our new start." Jedediah laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It was my new start, but he never made it." "Did he?" "And the debt remains. The law of this land is simple, my dear. A man's debts are passed on, and since you have no money—" He let his gaze drift over her, then to the children, and finally to the cabin. "The property he left behind becomes mine, and that includes everything on it." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That includes you." Before Lena could react, Leo darted forward, placing himself between his mother and the menacing man, a small rock clutched in his hand. "You leave her alone," the boy snarled, his voice trembling but full of a man's fury. Jedediah simply chuckled, looking down at the boy with contempt, a look that made Lena's blood run cold. Jedediah Thorne's chuckle was a low, dismissive sound that did more to ignite Lena's fear into fury than any shout could have. He waved a hand at Leo as if shooing a fly. Brave boy, but bravery doesn't pay debts. He turned his cold eyes back to Lena. I'll be back tomorrow. With the law, you can explain to the sheriff why you're squatting on my property. Or, he added, his voice dropping to a silky, venomous tone, you can be sensible. A smart woman knows when to make a new arrangement. He mounted his horse and rode off, not looking back, the threat hanging in the air like poison. That night, the cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a cage. The silence was different now. Not peaceful, but taut with unspoken fear and rising anger. Lena put the children to bed. Her movements jerky and forced. Willow was oblivious, but Leo lay stiffly on the cot, his back to the room. A silent, rigid pillar of outrage. Lena couldn't sit still. She paced the small floor, her mind racing, the shame of her late husband's weakness, the terror of Jedediah's claim, the crushing weight of her own helplessness. It all churned within her. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath it, a hot, unfamiliar ember of defiance began to glow. She would not be property. She would not be inherited like a piece of furniture. She went to the small, battered trunk that held the last vestiges of her former life. With trembling hands, she began to sift through its contents, searching for anything, any piece of paper that could refute Jedediah's claim. There wasn't much. A few worn letters from her family back east, her husband's shaving kit, a dried flower from their wedding day, and at the very bottom, a small leather-bound journal. She had never read it. Her husband had been a private man, and she had respected that. But now, she opened it, her heart pounding, searching for a defense, for a weapon. Silas watched her from his place by the hearth. He had returned just after dusk to a scene of suffocating tension. Lena had told him what happened, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, which was more alarming than tears. He saw the frantic energy in her now, the desperate search. The mocking words of Jedediah echoed in his mind, challenging not just his marriage, but his very character. For years, he had built his life around a single principle: to be left alone. He had walled himself off from the world, from its complications, from the pain of connection. These people, this woman and her children, were a breach in that wall. He had made a contract to keep them from freezing, a practical solution to a temporary problem. But this was different. This was a man's greed, a man's cruelty, aimed directly at them. To fight Jedediah was to declare them not his responsibility, but his own. It was to tear down the wall he had so carefully built, the option to simply let them go, to return to his quiet, uncomplicated existence. Was a ghost of a thought, dismissed almost as soon as it formed. He looked at Lena, her face pale in the lamplight, her brow furrowed in concentration. He looked at the cot where Willa slept, her small hand clutching a piece of wood he had carved for her. He saw the rigid set of Leo's shoulders. They were no longer just strangers. They were woven into the fabric of this cabin, into the scent of the air, into the quiet moments of his days. The choice, he realized, had already been made. It had been made the moment he lifted Lena from the snow. The next morning, Silas rose before dawn. He moved with a new, cold purpose. He told Lena to keep the door bolted and to let no one in. He took his rifle, but also a small bundle of papers from a locked box he kept under his bed. "I'm riding out," he said, his voice flat. "I have neighbors, men I trust. They need to hear this." It was a profound admission for a man like Silas, who had never asked for help from anyone. Lena watched him go, a new, fragile hope blooming in her chest, while he was gone. Lena continued her desperate search. The journal was filled with her husband's looping script, detailing crop prices, weather patterns, and his own quiet frustrations. And then she found it. Tucked between two pages was a letter, its paper thin and creased. It was from Jedediah Thorne? She read it, her breath catching in her throat. It was a gloating, cruel letter, outlining the terms of a loan for a fraction of the land's worth, written in a way that made it seem like a generous offer to a desperate man. It spoke of forgiving interest and flexible terms, but the intent was clear. It was a trap, designed to ensnare a man already drowning. It wasn't a legal document, but it was proof of Jedediah's predatory intent. Just as she folded the letter, her hands shaking, Leo came to her side. He was holding something in his hand. It was a small tin box, rusted at the edges. "I found it," he said, his voice low. "In the wagon. It was stuck under the floorboards." He had been out by the wreckage of their old life, his anger driving him to kick and tear at the broken frame, and in his rage. He had dislodged a loose board. Inside the box was a single, folded document. It was the official deed to the land in Helena, but attached to it with a pin was a signed receipt from Jedediah Thorne, acknowledging a partial payment, a payment made with the last of their savings. A payment Jedediah had conveniently failed to mention. It wasn't for the full amount, but it proved he was a liar. When Silas returned late that afternoon, he was not alone. Two other men rode with him, their faces grim and weathered. They were his neighbors, ranchers from the next valley over, men of few words but solid character. Silas introduced them simply as Mr. Olson and Mr. Davies. He had laid out the situation for them, and they had come to bear witness. They didn't have to wait long. Jedediah Thorne rode up to the cabin as the sun began to set, a local constable at his side. The constable was a young man who looked uncomfortable, clearly intimidated by Thorne's confident swagger. "Kane," Jedediah said, his voice smug. "I've come to claim my property. This is Constable Miller. He's here to ensure a peaceful transition." Silas didn't move from the porch. He stood, flanked by his neighbors. A silent, formidable trio. "This is my property, Thorne," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made the constable shift his feet nervously. "And this is my wife, Mrs. Kane?" He deliberately stressed the name. "A convenient marriage." Jedediah sneered. "It changes nothing. The debt is owed." "What debt?" Silas asked calmly. He held up the receipt Leo had found. "The debt that was partially paid, for which you gave a receipt, or the debt you tried to create with this predatory letter." He then held up the letter Lena had found. He didn't read it aloud. He didn't need to. He simply let the papers speak for themselves. He handed them to the constable, whose eyes widened as he read. Jedediah's face went from smug to purple with rage. That's a lie forged papers." Mr. Olson, a large man with a thick beard, stepped forward. "We know you, Thorne. We've heard stories of your dealings down in the valley. This smells like one of them." Mr. Davies nodded in agreement. The constable, no longer intimidated, looked at Jedediah with open disgust. The power had shifted. It wasn't about the law in a book anymore. It was about the law of a community. The judgment of one's peers. Jedediah was exposed, not by a gun, but by the quiet truth. Held in the hands of a silent man, a determined woman, and a brave little boy. Stripped of his bluster, with the cold eyes of three honest men upon him. Jedediah Thorne was left with nothing but his own shame. Jedediah Thorne did not leave with a thunderous roar, but with a choked, sputtering rage. He spat a curse at the ground, yanked his horse's reins, and galloped away. The young constable watching him go with a mixture of relief and contempt. Mr. Olson and Mr. Davies stayed for a short while, sharing a cup of coffee with Silas on the porch. Their conversation was sparse, touching on the weather and the price of cattle, But their presence was a solid, comforting affirmation. They were men of the land, and they understood that a neighbor's trouble was their own. A man's character is the only fence that holds, Mr. Olson said before they left. A piece of simple wisdom that settled deep in Silas's mind when they finally rode off. The sun had dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and violet. The immediate threat was gone, but a scar remained on the quiet landscape of their lives. The air in the cabin that night was lighter, but still carried the faint, metallic tang of fear. The confrontation had been a victory, but it had also unearthed the fragile foundations of their new life, reminding them how quickly it could all be taken away. That night, for the first time, Silas did not sleep on the floor. He took a spare blanket and made a bed for himself in the small loft above. A subtle shift that spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement that the lines had blurred, that he was no longer just a guardian watching from the floor, but a man living under the same roof. The peace that followed was not a gift, but something they now knew had to be consciously rebuilt. One day at a time, the healing began, as most things did in their world, with work. The next morning, Silas found that Jedediah, in a final act of petty malice, had kicked down a section of the new fence around the garden. He didn't curse or rage. He simply picked up his tools and began the slow, methodical work of repair. A few minutes later, Lena came out of the cabin, carrying a bucket of water. She set it down and, without a word, began picking up the scattered rails. Her movements were sure, her purpose clear. She was no longer just a guest in this place. She was its defender. Leo watched them from the porch for a long time. He saw the easy rhythm they fell into, passing tools, lifting logs, working together in a seamless, unspoken partnership. He saw the way Silas paused to watch a hawk circle overhead, and the small, tired smile Lena gave him. There was a quiet strength between them, a bond forged in the crucible of the past few days. The boy's heart, so long hardened by grief and suspicion, began to soften. He walked over to where they were working, his small hands clenched. "I can help," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Silas looked down at the boy. He didn't offer praise or a warm smile. He simply handed him a smaller hammer. "Hold the post steady," he said. And for the rest of the afternoon, the three of them worked together, the rhythmic sound of the hammer echoing in the quiet air. It was the sound of a family, rebuilding not just a fence, but the very walls of their world as they were finishing. Leo looked up at Silas, his eyes clear and direct for the first time. "Thank you, Ha," he said, the word coming out a little awkwardly, but with a sincerity that struck Silas deeper than any axe blow. Silas just nodded, but a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't known he was missing. In the weeks that followed, the land came alive with the vibrant green of spring. The unspoken contract between Silas and Lena began to dissolve, replaced by something deeper and more genuine. Their conversations, once limited to the practical, now drifted into shared hopes. They talked of expanding the garden, of buying another cow, of building a small smokehouse. One day, they worked together to haul the remains of Lena's old wagon up from the gully. It was a somber task, but necessary. Instead of burning it, Silas began to salvage the good wood from its frame. "Good oak," he said to Leo, running a hand over the weathered planks. "We can use this. Nothing is ever truly wasted." He was teaching the boy not just about carpentry, but about resilience. A few days later, Mr. Olson returned, leading a milk cow with a calf at her side. "A welcome to the valley, Mrs. Kane," he said to Lena, tipping his hat. "A place is only as good as the folks in it." The gift, so simple and profound, was a final stitch, mending the tear Jedediah had ripped in their world. One afternoon, Silas took Leo out beyond the pasture, into the woods that bordered the mountains. He began to show the boy how to read the signs of the forest, the track of a deer, the scratch marks of a bear on a tree, the call of a particular bird. He taught him not with many words, but with quiet gestures, with a hand on the shoulder, with a shared moment of stillness as they watched a fox disappear into the underbrush. It was in these moments that the wall around Leo finally crumbled completely. Replaced by a deep and abiding respect for the quiet man who knew the language of the wild land. The first real laugh came on a warm evening. Willa, trying to help her mother carry a basket of laundry, tripped over her own feet and tumbled head over heels into a pile of clean sheets. Emerging with a sheet over her head like a small, indignant ghost. The sight was so unexpected, so purely comical, that a short, sharp bark of laughter escaped Silas. Lena looked at him, surprised, and then a genuine, unburdened laugh bubbled up from her own chest. Leo, seeing them, cracked a smile, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with a sound it had never known before, the sound of simple, shared joy. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Willa, who had been playing with the silver locket from the tin box, climbed into Silas's lap. "Who is she?" Willa asked, holding up the locket. Lena held her breath. Silas looked down at the locket, then at Lena, his eyes asking for permission. She gave a slight nod. "That was my wife, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet. "And the boy in the picture was our son, Daniel. They were taken by the fever 5 years ago. I built this place for them." He spoke of his own journey, of the grief that had driven him into solitude, of the silence he had mistaken for peace. It was the most he had ever spoken of his past. And in sharing his own brokenness, he made space for hers. A few nights later, it was Lena who acted. After the children were asleep, she took the small, battered trunk outside. From it, she removed the last few items of her old life, her late husband's journal, the faded letters, the dried flower. She didn't look at them. She simply built a small fire in the clearing and, one by one, placed them in the flames. She was watching the paper curl and blacken when Silas came and stood beside her. He didn't speak, just stood with her, a silent witness. She wasn't erasing a memory, but releasing a ghost. She was letting go of the shame, the disappointment, and the life that might have been, in order to fully embrace the life that was. As the last ember died, she turned to him in the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered. And this time, the words meant more than just survival. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than practical necessity. And the simple, fleeting contact was more intimate than any embrace. When she came back to the cabin, her face was calm, her eyes clear. The past was finally where it belonged. Lena found that the passing of summer was not an ending, but a deepening. The frantic energy of spring, with its desperate planting and constant mending, softened into the steady, confident rhythm of growth. The days grew long and warm, filled with the drone of bees in the clover and the scent of sun-baked pine. The garden, once a patch of bare, hopeful earth, was now a riot of green, promising a bounty she had scarcely dared to imagine. The world they had fought for was no longer a dream, but a tangible, growing reality around them. The bond between them all grew in the quiet, shared moments of daily life. It was in the way Silas would now instinctively look for Lena's face across the dinner table, a silent question in his eyes that she could answer with a small nod. It was in the way Leo no longer hesitated to ask Silas for help with a difficult knot, or a stubborn piece of wood for the smokehouse they were building together. It was in the way Willa would fall asleep on the porch, her head in Lena's lap, while Silas's hand rested gently on the child's back. A gesture of unconscious, protective affection. The cabin, once a place of strained silences and unspoken contracts, was now filled with the low hum of a family at peace. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple gray. The memory of the winter blizzard was a ghost in the air. But this time, there was no fear. Silas and Lena moved with an unspoken synchronicity, securing the livestock and battening down the cabin. Huddled inside, listening to the rain lash against the roof, Lena felt not terror, but a profound sense of security. She was not alone against the storm. She was sheltered, not just by the cabin's walls, but by the quiet, steady presence of the man sitting across from her. Silas returned from town later that week with a small, carefully wrapped parcel. He handed it to Lena, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Inside was a bolt of deep blue calico fabric, dotted with tiny yellow flowers. It was the first gift he had ever given her, the first thing that was not born of pure necessity. Lena ran her hand over the smooth, cool cloth, her throat tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than a gift of fabric. It was an acknowledgement of her as a woman, not just a partner in survival. That evening, by the light of the lamp, she began to cut and sew, the soft snip of her scissors a quiet counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets outside. A week later, she wore the finished dress for the first time. It's simple. Clean lines, a stark contrast to the worn clothes she had arrived in. Silas said nothing, but the way his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin spoke more than words ever could. The following Sunday, Silas hitched the horse to the wagon. "We need supplies," he announced. Though his eyes were on Lena and her new dress, it was the first time they had all gone to town together as a family, as they walked through the dusty main street of Redemption. Lena felt a new sense of belonging. People nodded to Silas, their gazes shifting from him to her, and the children with a quiet, accepting curiosity, in the general store. The clerk who had witnessed their wedding now greeted her as Mrs. Kane, and the name, once a mark of a desperate contract, now felt like a warm, protective cloak. Autumn arrived with a crisp, golden light that set the aspen trees ablaze. The air grew sharp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, and the mountains in the distance seemed to draw closer, their peaks etched against a brilliant blue sky. It was time for the harvest. They worked together, a small, efficient team, moving through the rows of their garden. Silas, with his quiet strength, pulled the heavy potatoes and squash from the earth. Lena, with her patient hands, gathered the beans and corn, her movements a graceful dance of purpose. The children helped where they could, their laughter ringing out in the clear air as they chased each other with fistfuls of herbs. They filled baskets and crates, the vibrant colors of their harvest, the deep orange of pumpkins, the rich red of tomatoes, the earthy brown of potatoes, a testament to their shared labor. It was more than just food for the coming winter, it was proof. Proof that something beautiful and life-sustaining could grow from the harshest of soils. Proof that they had not just survived, but had truly put down roots in this wild, unforgiving land. As they carried the last of the harvest into the small root cellar Silas and Leo had dug, Lena paused and looked back at the empty garden, at the tilled earth waiting for its winter sleep. A profound sense of peace settled over her, a feeling of rightness that went bone deep. The smokehouse, built from salvaged oak and new-made bricks, was soon filled with the sweet, pungent scent of hickory smoke as they cured the meat from a deer Silas had brought down. He showed Leo how to properly stack the wood, how to read the color of the smoke. Another lesson in the patient, deliberate art of providing. It was a ritual as old as the mountains, a quiet act of faith in the future, a preparation for the inevitable return of the cold and the snow. That evening, as the first chill of night began to settle, they sat together on the porch, The day's work was done, the bounty of their labor safely stored away. A comfortable silence enveloped them, punctuated by the low crackle of the fire from inside the cabin. Silas sat in his usual chair, his hands no longer idle, but busy with a small block of pine, a sliver of wood curling away from his knife with each practiced stroke. He was carving a small, detailed horse for Willa, its form emerging slowly from the raw material. Leo sat on the porch steps. Willa nestled beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. He pointed up at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "That one," he said, his voice clear and confident. "That's the North Star. Pa showed me. It's the one that always stays put, so you can't ever get lost." He was no longer the angry, suspicious boy who had arrived in a storm, but a young man, secure in his place in the world, already passing on the knowledge he had learned. Lena sat beside Silas, a warm quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his, the rough wool of his shirt familiar and comforting against her cheek. She watched her children, her heart full. The silence between her and Silas was no longer a space of awkwardness or uncertainty, but a shared vessel of peace and understanding. It held everything that didn't need to be said. She looked out at the vast, dark silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains, no longer seeing them as a barrier, but as silent, steadfast guardians. "I used to think I was searching for a place," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the quiet. "But I think I was searching for you." Silas stopped carving. He didn't answer with words. He simply reached over and took her hand, his large, calloused fingers closing around hers in a grip that was both gentle and unbreakable. It was a promise, a confirmation, a quiet testament to the long, hard road they had traveled to find this simple, profound peace. And as the lamp in the window cast a warm, golden glow out into the vast, silent darkness of the Montana night, the small cabin stood not as an outpost of solitude, but as a beacon of hope, a tiny, resilient star in the heart of the great, Wild West.